There seems to be an idea abroad that it's only being used more or less by the affluent and upper classes largely. Is this true in any significant degree?
Well, it's hard to generalize about any drug, but I think compared to, say, marijuana, it is clearly a drug because it costs a lot that is restricted to people who have money. And in many ways, that is one of the reasons that the problems with it, I think, have been relatively few in recent years. That by and large, it's used by people who are already relatively successful, who use the drug with reasonably good judgment, and who limit the amount that they use because of how much it costs. And very frequently, the people who get into difficulty are the people for whom money is no problem. They have sufficient money that they can use as much cocaine as they want. And they do, and a certain percentage of them get into serious difficulties with coke as a result. But
didn't you just say two contradictory things, that the people who are affluent don't abuse it, and then you said that those who have enough money to use all they want do?
We're talking about having more money than the average and then being very affluent.
Oh, beyond
that. That it is, to have access to it, you've got to have a certain amount of money. So that it tends to be people above a median income level who have access to it. But even in that category, by and large, its cost is a constraining factor on how much you use.
So in other words, if the price went down to, you know, half what it is now or a fourth, you think the problem would be greater, not because more people would be using it, but because a different kind of people would be using it?
Well, we predicated most of the federal policy over the last several years basically on that belief, that if it was widespread and very cheap, that the problems, the percentage of people who have problems would go up substantially. One of the things that's really rather remarkable about cocaine use in this country at the present time is how few people get into difficulties with it, given its widespread use and the fact that it is quite a dangerous drug.
Why should the affluent be any more prone not to get in trouble with it than... we certainly know there are plenty of upper-class, intellectual, well-educated, and wealthy alcoholics. Why should they be smarter?
A lot of people do get into difficulties. I mean, I don't want to say that this is a drug without its problems, but what we're talking about is upward of 1 million people using it regularly. Something like 20 deaths a year associated with cocaine use, as compared to 2,000 who die from barbiturates. We're talking about 1/100th the number of deaths. We're talking about a certain percentage of people getting cocaine psychoses, getting erosion of their nasal mucosa, getting dependent on cocaine. But as a percentage of total users, it is surprisingly low.
What about the history of coke? My assumption's always been that it came from South America. I know they still chew the coca leaf in Peru, the workers, that it's used there to keep people from fatigue and hunger.
There are millions of people in South America, so-called coqueros, who chew the coca leaf. They carry them around a bag on their shoulder and put a wad in their mouth and chew it for about 45 minutes. And they use it at work. It's said to make the circumstances of their life more bearable. These are people who are underfed, overworked, so forth and so on. And it's been very difficult to establish, although a number of attempts have been made, that this is terribly deleterious to these people. It came to the, one of the amazing things about its history is how long it was ignored by the West. The Spanish chroniclers of the conquest looked down their nose at the Indians and everything the Indians did, and that is in such contrast to tobacco, which had such an immediate growth in the European nations. But one of the people who there are a number of people who were responsible for its pricking up its interest in it in the West. One of them was an Italian neurologist by the name of Paolo Mantegazza, who published an account in 1859 of coca, and it was really a rather dramatic account. He spoke of using coca, how he was transported in 77,000 different worlds, and how he would...
different worlds?
Different worlds.
Is he the one who said, I'd rather spend 10 years with coke than 100,000 without it?
Exactly. And in fact, he's one of the three people who was influential with Freud. And when you read this, one wonders why Freud was influenced by such an effusive account. In fact, though, he did talk about quite somberly about its medical utilities and had some cautionary comments, and that perhaps made it more believable. Then a fellow by the name of Aschenbrandt in 1883 put some cocaine clandestinely into the water of Bavarian soldiers who were about to go on maneuvers with the expected results, and Freud was influenced by that, and Freud finally was influenced by an American by the name of W.H. Bentley, who was publishing in the Detroit Therapeutic Gazette, which was at that time a very prestigious medical journal, on the utility of cocaine for the treatment of morphine addiction.
To get people off morphine.
To get people off morphine. Yeah. And it was Freud who caused a lot of interest in this drug when he published in June of 1884 his first paper called On Coca. Now, mind you, cocaine had been isolated then in 1860, but at that time the distinction between coca and cocaine wasn't made. So the paper was called On Coca, but it really dealt with cocaine. And this paper caused quite a bit of interest, and in fact, 1884 was kind of an annus mirabilis for cocaine. Lots of things happened, but certainly that's the beginning of, in a sense, the modern history of cocaine.
Freud must have given a lot of respectability because of his position, and
well, at that time he didn't have. I mean, this was before.
Well, that's right. He was not that well. But anyway, in his early years, he gave it to his wife, his sister, her sister, I think. And he took it himself.
Well, he took it himself.
And he also, but he also claimed to have ruined a friend's life. Whether Dr. Fleischl was it?
Yes. Ernst.
He was a morphine addict, I gather. Fleischl was a friend of Freud's and colleague.
Fleischl was a friend who had lost a thumb and had phantom pain and became a morphine addict in his attempt to treat this phantom pain. And Freud...
Phantom pain?
That is, yeah, the limb is no longer there, or the digit is no longer there, but one has pain in the digit as though it were there, or whatever part is missing. Yeah. And Freud attempted to treat von Fleischl with cocaine, believing that that was the way to get around the morphine addiction. In fact, it was a cause of great regret for Freud, because he saw what happened to his friend Fleischl, who developed the phenomenon of coke bugs, apparently had a cocaine psychosis. Freud said that one of the most fearful nights of his life was the night he spent with Fleischl, when Fleischl had, I believe, was coke bugs and some paranoid delusion. He was trying to pick these imaginary bugs out of his skin and scratching away at it.
Leslie, have you seen anybody get in bad trouble, a friend of yours, with coke?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I've seen it frequently, and I suspect that your opinions, Dr. Bourne, that is not that harmful, may depend upon the fact that the abuse of it is very recent in our society. I think the reason I'm supposedly here on the show is because I think it can be murder on you, and it results, for example, in, well, I don't know about cocaine psychosis per se, but irritability. Irritability increases and increases to violence. Let's talk about wife beating. Let's talk about husband beating. Let's talk about hallucinations. Let's talk about the abuse of your talent. Yeah. If you work on cocaine, and that you might even destroy what is a fine gift for movie making, singing even. Your voice is destroyed, your music is destroyed. I could go on and on.
Well, does your experience with the drug arc completely from early pleasant experience through trouble? Can you compare the two, the good and the bad?
It doesn't arc. I think cocaine's attractiveness is so intense that the abuses are a very happy sacrifice. And it's the sort of thing that is cyclical, so that if you abuse it, you can feel better about the abuse by doing more of it.
You see, I'm inclined to agree with Peter. I think that the potential for harm of cocaine has been exaggerated. Now, this doesn't mean to say that what Leslie says is not true. It is, but it bears the same kind of relationship as alcohol and social drinking does to alcoholism. I mean, people can use cocaine and use it moderately and intelligently and not get into difficulty. But it is a drug which can be abused, and people who abuse it, just as 5 to 10% of people who drink become alcoholics. Certainly, there are people who abuse cocaine, and they can certainly harm themselves. But I think that it isn't. I don't think that one can say that there is an inherent psychopharmacological property of the drug such that if one uses it, one will necessarily abuse it. I think that we have to consider that there are some people who are particularly vulnerable to abuse it. In my experience, people who are dealing with depression or feelings of inadequacy or low self-esteem. I mean, this is the drug par excellence, which is a kind of home therapy for these kinds of problems. But I think we shouldn't confuse use of cocaine and abuse of it, and to believe that one naturally or inevitably leads to the other.
Can you ever, Leslie?
I think that you can't compare alcohol and cocaine in terms of abuse, because the addictive personality is so much more easily turned on by a drug that has so few immediate bad side effects. You don't have a hangover in the morning.
We don't know what an addictive personality is.
Well, you do, I don't.
Well, I don't, and I don't. I don't believe there is such a thing, you say.
It is so attractive. You were talking about the poor. The poor, the ghettos, should have cocaine dispensers. I mean, if you're going to talk about the work that's so dull that you can't get through it and that life is miserable, why shouldn't we be able to have a drug that suddenly makes you feel that everything is not only worthwhile but fascinating? I think that's very hard to forget.
You know, this comment on the addictive personality, I'm reminded of a funny comment that Ernest Jones, the biographer of Freud, says about Freud. He said that the fact that Freud was able to give up cocaine proves that he didn't have, after all, an addictive personality. He doesn't comment on the fact that Freud could never give up cigars, except for 1 year, and continue to. I think it's very difficult to talk about an addictive personality. There's a lot of talk in the psychiatric literature, a lot written about it, but I just don't believe Mr. Bacalhau and I have looked at that very carefully, and we can't find something that we can be comfortable with.
That proves it's an addictive...
So the person who by virtue of certain personality traits, which can be specified, is particularly vulnerable to addiction.
You can't pick out and predict who...
No, absolutely not, except insofar as I think, as I say, people who are suffering from certain kinds of internal pain, depression, or feelings of inadequacy, but this would run across all personality
Well, people
types.
take it for depression in some cases, but then also an effective long-term use is depression, isn't it? Or is that an effective withdrawal?
Well, interestingly enough, the scientific studies which have been done by Drs. Post and Coton at NIDA testing cocaine for its utility in depression have not been very impressive. And yet, I think we're talking about rather more severe depressions than the kinds of depressions, everyday depressions of somebody feeling down. I mean, people went to get Coca-Cola mostly because they were feeling low and they wanted to feel better, and they'd go and get a Coke.
If I had some cocaine in my pocket now, first of all, would I be vulnerable to arrest if I were to take it out and say, here it is?
Yes, you would.
And in various states it differs, radically, I guess.
In this state, if you had 2 ounces or more, you would be... there's a mandatory life imprisonment and no parole before 15 years.
Texas, I think, is one of those, is it? Or Missouri, perhaps? I'm not sure.
New York is one of the severest states. The federal law now is 1 year for possession and $1,000.
It's fairly strict in most states, but the extent to which it's enforced for simple possession varies widely, so that in many states, for instance in California, it's used widely, but not many cases are made against people for simple possession.
We only have a couple minutes left in this show, believe it or not. If I took this Coke out of my pocket and sucked it up my nose for the first time, what would I feel?
Great.
I'd feel great.
Nothing.
I'd feel nothing. You want to bid on this?
You feel nothing?
Not the first time. Coke, like marijuana, usually has to be used a number of times before one can get the effect. And most authorities believe that it's a matter of learning how to perceive these very subtle effects. Most people who do it the first time get nothing but a numb nasal mucosa and maybe a numb palate.
Are you speaking from experience?
I am not speaking from experience.
For what does experience tell you?
Well, the opposite. And is there time for an anecdote?
Yes, if it's less than 2 minutes.
It's 30 seconds. A friend of mine pointed out today that the way we used to get our parents to approve of marijuana smoking was to give them a few puffs and say, "See, Mom, see, Dad, it's great." And they go, yeah, nothing happens. I feel nothing. Well, yeah, it must be fine. A couple of toots later, a couple of snorts later on marijuana, they're flying like the rest of us. So yeah, once or twice.
You're talking about on coke, you mean?
I'm sorry, on marijuana.
On marijuana, yeah.
So in other words, at the beginning, the parents say, yeah, it's harmless. But if they smoked it the way the kids did, it wouldn't be harmless. If you were doing it the way the users were doing it, then a whole packet would send you flying.
So you know that you can get a high the first time if you use enough the first time. But it's possible to take one sniff or snort and not.
It'd be like a cup of coffee.
Why isn't there a great move to legalize it if it's comparable to marijuana and no one here seems to think it's terribly harmful?
Well,
or dangerous?
I don't think it would be fair to say that we don't think it has a potential for harm. I think, speaking for myself and I think for Peter, we do believe that it has a potential for harm. I believe that that potential has been exaggerated since let's say about 1914 in this country. I would predict that there will be, in fact, I've heard of an organization in Florida that is already organizing a kind of lobby group for decriminalization of cocaine. And I expect in the future there will be more of that kind of interest.
One of the reasons...
Can I get a time signal? I don't know if we're out of time or not. But, oh, we have 30 seconds.
Very few people get arrested for simple possession, as you have with marijuana, where you smoke it publicly very often, where it smells and it attracts attention. Large numbers of young people were arrested for simple possession of marijuana, and this built a political constituency. Very few people, in fact, are arrested for possessing small amounts of cocaine. So you haven't had this building of a political constituency or pressure group for decriminalization.
Yeah. Dr. Bourne, Dr. Grinspoon, and Leslie, we will be back tomorrow night with the same subject. There are a lot of fascinating aspects that we haven't covered.